All right, cool. So with me today is Greg Thomas. Do you prefer Gregory? Because I've seen that on some of your stuff too, and I'm like, I don't know many
Greg?
people who prefer Gregory over Greg.
Yeah, Greg is fine. That's what most of my friends call me. I just put my full name sometimes because
It's more
if you look up
professional.
different producers and things like that, there are multiple Greg Thomases out
I did
there.
notice that when I was trying to find various stuff on you, but then I just gave up when I was like, that's not you.
Yeah, there's and a lot of my like if you go on a Discogs or All Credits or things like that, a lot of my records are scattered underneath all these other producers as well. There's no like definitive list pretty much. So
Well, I suppose imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
yeah.
So thank you first and foremost for taking the time out of your busy day of recording. I know you were recording a band from around the Michigan area, I think,
Yeah,
Lakeshore or
Lake Effect. Yeah.
Lake Effect. So many lake bands now. Um, and
Yeah,
then you
thanks for having.
just yeah, and I was gonna say I know you just finished up the Conveyor record, which sounds great. I've been jamming that quite a bit since it came out. I think like what 2 weeks ago now.
Yep. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I guess let's start with the cliche background. What got you into music?
Well, my father is a jazz pianist. Was a jazz pianist throughout the '80s. So I grew up going to different like clubs. I guess like we wouldn't have like babysitters. I would just go with him to different places, and he'd be playing in the New England area pretty consistently through till about the mid '90s. Then he switched careers. So I kind of had a love for music from that, and then started my own bands in probably like '96 was probably like my first like little punk band in my basement, and then still am doing little punk bands in my basement. I guess 20 years later.
What uh what does one do when they stop being a pianist for a living?
He went into computer programming, which is funny because the like computers and math and fields of that nature are very similar to music in certain ways. So he was able to like apply a lot of the like analytical aspects of his mind similarly. Like if you're reading a piece of classical music or reading a piece of code, I know it sounds like they're completely different, but it taps into whatever half of the brain, in the same way. So
Interesting. I definitely wouldn't have thought of that, but it does apply very well. So what kind of getting into punk bands and playing around and stuff like that, like I know some of the bands that you have eventually played in are more of the like metal hardcore kind of thing, but it seems like you kind of lean more toward a punk kind of aesthetic from what I've seen of your personal taste. So how did you where was the transition maybe of your own personal influences that went from maybe like a Misfits to I'm assuming it was Metallica because that kind of seems like the easiest transition.
I got into metal first
Oh,
was my first love, but you are correct with the punk background because in Connecticut in the mid 90s when I was getting into this stuff, the scene that I kind of went into was this like crust punk grindcore scene that was really big in Connecticut at the time. We had bands like The Pissed, State of Fear, Hail of Rage, React, Deformed Conscience, all these bands. So when I was going to my first shows, they were at punk venues. So even though I was like the metalhead that grew up listening to thrash metal, like, yeah, Metallica, Megadeth, things of that nature. And then, but all my first shows were all like punk shows. And I started doing sound for a venue when I was pretty young, like '97 or something like that. I was like a sophomore in high school. I started doing sound at a punk venue around here called The Pit. And I did sound for like The Casualties and Pig Destroyer and Anal Cunt and all these crazy bands from the time period. But it was like how I got into underground music was through punk, even though I was a metalhead first.
it's really weird you mentioned the Casualties. I just saw their last original member quit the band.
Really?
Yep,
Oh, that's
it's the
yeah. They
last
were.
last one.
I mean, when I did like I remember doing sound with them at this place. It's like such a clear memory because I thought it was such a big deal. But looking back at like photos, there was like 10 kids there, 15 kids there.
Those are some of the best shows though.
Those are pretty much always my favorite shows. I was actually just talking to a friend about how smaller shows, how much more they tend to resonate. And I was thinking back on some of the shows that I did with Misery Signals, and I was thinking back to, in specific, one of my favorite shows was in Trenton, New Jersey, at like the back of like a restaurant or something like that for the absent light, like right around when we were doing absent light, and there was like 200 kids there, and that was as many kids as you could possibly fit in. But that show meant more to me and was more fun and connected with like the feeling of that I used to have in my youth. You know, like the excitement, the energy, the companionship of hardcore punk. That connected with it more than the shows that would have like 600 kids at them. Even though those
Right.
shows obviously really cool in their own right and they have their own kinetic energy. There's something about the small intimate show that is like that's where hardcore punk tells its story the best.
Right. Um, well, I mean, yeah, you kind of actually jumped ahead before I even could ask you the question of how you got into production as a whole, or even doing sound. Was that something that you were naturally leaning towards, or were you wanting to like just kind of like I know some places like you go to a venue enough and you just kind of like are the kid that's always there, and then maybe like you ask a bunch of questions while a show's going, and then maybe that dude's like, oh, I'm gonna be out of town for this one show, can you like do this? Is it
That's
kind of like
that's that's pretty much exactly what happened. I was a kid there. I was probably like 15 or something, and I kind of was figuring it out. I was also figuring out recording around the same time because my dad used to record his own bands, and he used to record them in the basement. He had reel-to-reel tape machines, which I still have in the studio,
oh wow.
and I started doing. I just had these reel-to-reels, and I started doing demos for my friends' bands like right away. Like, oh, I'm going to play guitar. Like 6 months later, I'm going to make a demo, and they sounded terrible, but they were
Do you still have
fun.
those?
So, I wish I still had all on cassette tape. All recorded on reel to reel or cassette tape and stuff. I probably have a couple kicking around. I'd love to listen back to them. But I started doing that, and I just continued to do that. I never wanted to do recording as a career. Um, it wasn't on my mind at all. I was actually I went to college for a dual major in mathematics and English, and after like 2 years of college, I was playing in this band with Honor at the time. We got a chance to do like a really cool tour, and I just like left in the middle of a semester and just never went back. Like, and started recording shortly after that.
Where something I've always found interesting because kind of like an acquaintance friend of mine, Josh Schroeder, who works out of Random Awesome Studios up in Bay City up here, uh, kind of a lot, very similar. Like was in a band, was actually a screen printer, and then just kind of like would do their own demo, the band's own demos for the band Besieged that he was in, and then eventually when the band was done, just kind of segued into recording, uh, and then now basically does stuff for like the Color Morale and things like that. But what's interesting is I don't really feel like anyone's really ever gone into production for the sheer fact that they love it and they wanted to go down that route. It was more out of necessity of like, I can't afford to go to a studio, so I'll figure out a way to track my own shit, and then people like it and go, hey, record me.
Totally. I mean, I was always fascinated by it because I grew up around it. I was trying to, I remember when I was like really young, I would make mixtapes for my friend, and I would like talk in between songs and pretend like the mixtape was like a radio show that I was doing. So like I was always messing around with recording, and when I decided to make a full time go of it, which is in 2004 now, so like um, when I decided to make a full time go of it, it was partially because I had just done an EP for a band that I was in at the time, and it cost me like $5,000, and I was like, I just can't. I could never do a full length for this band. I could never afford doing a full length for this band unless I record it. And then also, a lot of my friends were doing albums where they were paying a lot of money and they weren't sounding that great. They were working with engineers that didn't give a shit, that they were just like the small footnote, like, all right, I'm just going to make some money. Like, you're in and out in a couple days. Thanks for the album. Good luck on your career. And they would spend like years touring on this thing that was recorded in like a week. That's all they could afford. And there's mistakes on it and all this stuff. So I kind of had it in my head that I was like, I should do a studio to make my own record, but I should do a studio so that all my friends can like actually record music and with somebody that just honestly gives a shit.
Right.
Like cares about if the song is cool, if the riff is cool, if the part's cool, if it sounds good, if there's a mistake, like, and that's kind of been the precedent that I set since starting the studio. Like big or small band, like I try to approach each one like it is the most important record that I can make at that time for me. And that just came out of a reaction of a lot of people just cashing in on, hey, you can record on a computer, so I'm going to get a computer and just charge these bands whatever, not give a shit, and pump out stuff. They didn't care about crafting albums or releases or songs so much as it was just like easy money. You could record on whatever. And I I really got into recording and really wanted to pursue it as a direct reaction to that, where I just wanted to be an engineer.
Right. What because something that I find interesting, and you had already said that you've been doing this for, if my math's correct, 13 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just the technology difference, like, because it didn't seem like necessarily that you probably had amassed a shitload of gear early on. It was just probably very rudiment in the setup you had.
Yeah.
So, what? Trying to figure out the best way to ask this. What was the? How did you keep? How did you learn? Like, I mean, obviously, if you're working with friends band, they're going to be a little more lenient on mistakes and maybe it not being the best product that you could
Well,
put out. But at what point do you kind of realize, like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this, and I'm having fun doing this and piecing together someone else's stuff?
it was. I mean, it was pretty. I got to say, like, I am fortunate enough that my dad had some gear, from recording himself, and he thought the idea of doing a studio was really cool. So he did help, like, invest and did do some work in the studio when it was starting up. So I did have some stuff to work with. He had been doing it for a number of years, and yeah, the first day that I had the computer set up with Pro Tools and everything ready to go, first time I ever sat down at Pro Tools HD, I had a client here. So like I just got it together in time. It was this band Signs of Hope, sold like melodic hardcore band from Connecticut, first record I did, and they were just here, and I just got everything set up. Finally, everything came in, and I was just off to the races. And it was, for me, it was full time at that point till now. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of first records I did that sound really, really bad because I was like trying to figure it out. And would discover things like, oh man, I can edit this stuff. So I have like a period of like a couple years where like my records are way too edited sounding because I was like, holy shit, you can do this. This is great. And so it's been a long process, figuring it out because I am self taught. I'm you know primarily self-taught. I had a couple people that would come in and work here part-time that had experience that would help me out and show me certain things, but it was definitely a long learning curve for me, and I feel like I'm still learning. Like I think every record that I do sounds a little better than the last one or things like that. And I don't think I'll ever get to the point where I'm like, wow, I'm good at this. I'm always like, shit, I need to work on this. That's all I hear when I listen back to records I do. It's like, fuck, I could have done that better. But it was a slow learning process. But I have been full time since the first day. Like I had another job, and I just never went back to it. It was full time since day one.
What kind of going back to the band thing, how hard is it to juggle, like, you said you were in a band that was kind of hitting the road and so forth, but then you also have this career basically at home that requires you to be home. It's not like you can kind of take it on the road with you and do it. So how hard was it to kind of balance the pursuit of one passion for another?
Well, I one thing I say, when people ask me about how to get into recording, or like if they're like, hey man, I really want to do this, I want to go to school for this, or I want to do whatever, one of the best pieces of advice that I have for them is to be in a band that is active, that is touring, because um, it is hard to balance, but that's where you meet people. That's where like a lot of people do record with me because it's like, oh hey, it's Greg from Misery Signals or Shai Hulud or any of these bands, and they're like, hey, we want to work with that guy because of this or this record that he did or whatever. So I do think it's important, if you're doing recording, to be have your own band going to some extent. Like if you can't make your own music, how can you help inform people how to make decisions with their music?
Right.
But as far as balancing touring and stuff like that, I would take stuff on the laptop. Like I take stuff on a laptop and I do all my edits when I'm on the road and stuff like that. I do all it, like it never stops. I work every day. That's part of owning your own business, is that you're your own boss, which people are like, oh, free time, but in reality it means no free time at all.
No.
So I take it on the road and I try to balance out things. I also co-own the studio now with this guy Chris Teddy, who's a very talented engineer. He plays in his own band, The World Is a Beautiful Place, and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die. Super long band
Longest
name,
title ever.
longest band name. Which when he was like joining that band right when they were starting, pretty much, I used to always give him grief over the title. I was like, this title's ridiculous, but in the end, it actually people remember it. They just call him like, oh, it's long band name, or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
But
I was just
anyway, so sorry.
good.
So he tours, and we kind of balance it out. Like, I'll try to set up tours that I do around when he's got a record coming in, or I'll set up records around when he goes on tour. So we kind of like balance the schedule together.
It's interesting. Like it's kind of nice to have someone to be able to lean on to help out and carry the load a little bit.
Yeah,
Um,
I anywhere where I am today without him. He's like, he started as an intern here and then is just a co-owner now. Like, he's a hardworking, dedicated, great friend that's made it possible.
you kind of spoke of your time in Shai Hulud, which that's a band that's pretty consistently on the road all the time. How did you like touring? I mean, I always feel like it's kind of interesting when someone's like in a band and they just try to do it like with a band that like with their friends and so forth. And I feel like after a while, there's that plateau where maybe the people you're around just aren't willing to go all in to get to that next level. And so either you have to restart all over again with a new band and find people who hopefully say they are all in and actually mean it, or in the case of a lot of times, take that next level where somebody through a tour or whatever, and it's like, hey, like we need a guitar player, can you fill in for us, or you want to join or whatever. What's it like kind of going from that level to kind of getting to the next tier of like being in a recognized band and playing out where people actually know your songs and know the songs you're playing?
Like you're saying, basically being in like smaller bands and then joining a bigger band like
Yeah,
that. Like,
because like case in point, there's this the newer guitar player for Dance Gavin Dance, Andrew Michael Wells, who has his own band, Iadola or Iadola, however you pronounce it. Um, but they're like Iadola is like kind of on the cusp of like breaking really big, like especially with this last record. But he's in a more established band and got the gig just due to like I guess playing a show with them way back in the day. They're like, hey, you're a good vocalist and you can play guitar, so like, hey, like, do you want to play in the band and help us out? And he's been in the band for a while now, like touring. But it's kind of like I've kind of see it, and I'm like, man, it's kind of got to be weird. Like you're so close to like doing your own, like the thing that you started, but then now you started like you're in this other thing where you have success, and it's like, is the goal to kind of slowly balancing it all out to where like you get both to work out, or does it end up being the thing where it's like, okay, well this one's taking off and has a name, all right, I kind of got to let that one drop and kind of get the goal of like being the touring musician and being on good tours and making the money, because it's kind of the ultimate goal I would assume is to be able to play out and play music.
for sure. Yeah, that's actually been a very that's a good question. That's like been a very important part of my career, is that I mentioned earlier that I had started the studio to record a full length for a band that I was doing at the time. Like, I'd done an EP that cost a lot of money and everything, and then that full length, it was this band called The Risk Taken, and that full length I was working on for like years around here, and like really working, trying to make this, putting my all into this record. And then all of a sudden I got the chance to play in Halud, which I only played in for like not too long, like 2006 to 2007, something like that. But I produced and made the album Misanthropy Pure with them, which was the real exhausting experience from playing with them. But ever since I did that, I never really went back to that record that I started the studio with, which is like my passion project, the whole reason I am even doing what I'm doing. And I've not, because I did Halud, and then when that fell through, I had a couple years of filling in and helping some other bands, and then I basically got the call from Ryan for Misery Signals. So like I never really made it back to my own material, and it's like it is like my goal for like this year or the next year or so is to get back to writing my own stuff, because it is fun. I mean, it was an amazing experience playing in Shai Hulud and playing in Misery Signals because I loved both those bands before being in those bands. Like Hulud was my favorite band in high school, and Misery Signals, you know, I'd always liked those guys. I was on one of their first tours when I was playing with Honor for the brief, you know, half a year or whatever that I played with that band. The reason I quit school was to go on tour, and I did a little tour with Misery Signals, like their first or second tour.
Right.
And so playing with those guys has been amazing. And I will say that I've learned, especially, well, no, from both those bands, I learned a lot. I learned a massive amount about how to approach music, how to play stuff, learning other people's material. I mean, that's like a humbling thing as a musician because you can play your own stuff and think you're doing fine, and then learn somebody else's rhythms or chord voicings, and you're like, shit, I really need to practice. Um, so, you know, I got derailed from this whole reason I started the studio, and I'm hoping to make it back to that soon. But it's been 13 years, you know, like 10 years, the Halud stuff. So it is hard balancing your own stuff. I think it's great playing and making music in other bands, but I do feel like if you have the artistic drive to write your own material, you'll always want to do that, and that'll always in some way be a priority. You know, and you can see that with stuff like you know, one of my dear friends, Mike Moynihan, who plays in the band Hollow Earth.
Hmm.
He was also in Halud after me. He was the singer for a while, and he left that to do Hollow Earth because that was his project. That's what he put his heart and soul into, and that's what he wanted to make. And I think, you know, he's happier doing that. He's like, he's doing exactly what he wants to be doing. And you know, and the band might have been smaller for a little while, but I think they're doing better now, and he's like making progress with that. And at the end of the day, if you're a songwriter, that's the happiest you can be, is to just be getting your songs out in front of people.
No, for sure. Was I mean, cause speaking to recording an album with both Shai Hulud and Misery Signals, you doing Absent Light and the record you had talked about for Shai
Yeah,
Hulud.
yeah.
What's it like writing for a band that's not your band? And for those listening on the audio, I did air quotes there. Because I mean, at that point, you have to adapt someone else's writing style within reason, while still kind of adding your thing, but not totally alienating the sound that had come before you. And you've done
Uh,
that at least twice now, so I've always wondered like how hard is it to come into something like that and figure out like where you fit in the writing process.
it's a tricky thing. I mean, a lot of the influences that I have that I was talking about, like the kind of more extreme music stuff that I grew up with, the kind of crustier, grindier, black
Mhm.
metal stuff that I was into in the 90s and stuff like that, it'll creep into when I'm writing something for like Misery Signals, but I do have to make it still sound like Misery Signals. That was a challenge. In particular, more than the Halud stuff, because a lot of the Halud stuff came together through their guitarist Matt Fox. He's very hands-on, writes most of the stuff. But with Misery Signals, the coolest thing about being a part of that band was that Ryan brought me in as like an equal right away. So it was like, we're gonna write. You write half the songs. I write half the songs. You know, you write half the, or probably a little less than half the lyrics or whatever. And he's gonna write. And like we split it like right away. And yeah, I what I had to do was just listen through the records and soak in the records, which I was already a fan of, but I had to really listen to it and see what I thought I could, you know, add and what I thought I could capture of what they did. You know, it is definitely a challenge. I think learning the older songs helps because you're like, oh, you use this chord a lot. Well, I'm going to use this chord and it'll sound like the failsafe or something like that.
Right. Yeah. That's
So you
something as
figure out
a
specifics. But
yeah, I was gonna say that's something as a random like person who likes playing guitar, and when you get into a band and you start figuring out like, for instance, like System of a Down, like if there was ever a new song I wanted to learn, it's like okay, I know Darren likes to write a chorus progression in the using these like five or six chords in
yeah,
some different progression one way or the other, but when you have that root down or the bass down to kind of figure it out, it's interesting to see. And then I noticed like when I would start trying to jam some ideas out, it's like oh, that sounds like, and it's like, oh, well, no shit, because you've just been jamming, like, this band, their discography for a while, and all of a sudden now, like, they're in your headspace. So when you're writing, of course, you're going to pick up on these little, like, accents or whatever. But,
absolutely. I think that that's an important thing to listen to it. Also, I think what made it a little easier for me, or at least was a skill set that I was able to bring to that was being a full time record producer. So with that in mind, I'm very hands on with a lot of projects. Like the Conveyor record, they were kind of in between guitarists when they came in on that, so I ended up writing some material for that, playing a lot of the guitar parts on that. I had to become what they needed to get that record done, and that happens with a lot of albums because recording's intense. Bands are always losing members or doing whatever, or even if the band is intact, I want to get into the songwriting with them. I want to get in, like, oh, why are you making this decision here? Maybe we should do this, or let's try this thing out. So I had experience coming in and analyzing what other people are doing and trying to modify or picking up on their traits. And I think that skill set is what helped me in writing those records. Not saying it wasn't really challenging. And for Misery Signals, the first, I don't even know, like 3 or 4 songs I wrote for that album, I was like, it's just not going to work. I threw them out and then had to keep doing it till like I started to, I think it started to get the feel right, and yeah, it's definitely a challenge. That's funny because I haven't actively thought about that. That's like a good question, but that is like a challenging thing, and like I said, it happens with production all the time too, where you have to just get into the mindset of the band. And I will say, just a quick thing, one of the best ways to do that, and I did that with Misery Signals, and I do that with every band that I produce, is I listen to the records that influence them, not just what they did, but I have discussions with the band. Like, when we were getting ready to write Absent Light, I was like, okay, Ryan, what were you listening to when you wrote Malice? You're listening to Cave In, you're listening to Hum, you're listening to these things. And then I would listen to those records instead of trying to rip off the band's previous material. Instead of like, hey, this riff is like something on Malice, but a little different. I tried to go back to the source of what inspired them when they were writing Malice. And then I listened to those records and tried to do my own versions of those kind of riffs first. Like that was the primary discussion on how to approach it.
So something I think I had seen you say somewhere, I don't know exactly where at this point, but you kind of had mentioned doing your due diligence on going back, like for example, Misery Signals or even Conveyor, and listening to the records they've already done, and then even to the point of listening to their influences. So with a band like Misery Signals, where you're coming in and kind of for the first time, like having the band self-produce the record, you're going back through and listening to a pretty raw sounding record in Malice that was done, if I'm not mistaken, by Devin Townsend.
Yep.
And then you go to Mirrors, which I don't remember who recorded Mirrors off the top of my head, but it has its own completely different sound that kind of, to me, became a little bit more of what they were doing on Malice, refined and kind of honed. But then you get to Controller, and I feel like that's my favorite record. I think production wise,
That's also
it
Devin
just
Townsend.
sounds huge. And I know, and it's Devin Townsend, and I think it's a difference of kind of like you were saying earlier of Malice came out and maybe it was a band that didn't have a whole lot of money because they're a new signed band, they're a newer band, and so it's kind of this is the best we could do with the money we had and the time we had to record it. Whereas I wonder if they would have had the money and the time, if maybe Malice wouldn't have sounded more like Controller since Devin did both, or
Yeah,
how much.
I actually think it's not necessarily was an issue of budget so much as it was technology wasn't there yet
Okay.
on Mal. Like okay, so like it's like they did spend time recording it, but I think 2004 they did that in 2004. People are just figuring. I mean, Pro Tools had been around, but digital recording is like still cutting its teeth, and people are like, you got guys like Adam D like figuring out like, oh, I can really get these like triggers sounding good with Kill Switch, or I can get these. I remember when Poison the Well Opposite of December came out and they had the triggered kick drum, and you were like, holy crap, you can hear the bass drum on this record. Like 2004 is only a few years after that. So
Right.
so Devin Townsend is a brilliant producer. And I do think that they spent a while. I think they did spend like weeks, maybe even the same amount of time, or a similar amount of time on that. But technology itself, if you listen to Devin Townsend's records from that time period, they don't sound nearly as good as they did just a few years later because the technology for digital recording improved so much, so rapidly.
What I was trying to remember too was if, because I know at that point, and I don't remember when Alice in Palace's Burn record came out, but obviously Devin did that one too. But there's not really a whole lot of similarities between the two records as far as like the same dude did it, and I want to say they were released in the same year or pretty close.
Yeah, I'll say that one thing about Devin, who I've never met but I respect a lot, is that he himself is an artist. He's not just a producer. So a lot of his records do sound different between multiple records because he is trying to make art. He's trying to capture a vibe and a feel more than he is dial in a setting,
Right.
if that makes sense. So. Um, there's a degree of that. I do think that the band was, tighter when they were going into Controller. They had tour, they were at a point leading into Controller where they were playing 300 shows a year. That's a
Right.
lot.
Yeah.
So they're be tighter. They're going to sound better naturally. You
Yeah.
know.
But no, I was gonna say with that though, like when you're going back and looking at some of these like producers, or even to the effect of like maybe some of these bands that you're delving back into the bands that they're into, and maybe stumbling across like like a Ross Robinson or like a Terry Date, or I mean, inevitably, I feel like with bands and the members being around my ages, like 30s, maybe late 20s, those are the names that are going to come up regardless.
Yeah.
That have you found little things that you've noticed like through studying some of these other like big name producers that had their like thumbprint on that like a specific genre, like Terry Date and Ross Robinson had their hands like on metal and new metal for like a
Yep.
solid like almost 20 years there, and then you're starting to get people like Devin Townsend in the late early 2000s and so forth, and a handful of people like that, like Garth Richardson and stuff like that. You're getting a lot of, and Adam D, as you mentioned, that are kind of putting their own stamp like on a specific genre. Like, have you noticed like little nuances that kind of like going back and listening to these things that like you're like, holy shit, I can't believe I never noticed that until I went back to listen to something in preparation for a record I'm working on.
Oh, for sure. One of the things that I do occasionally when I am listening to those older records is I'll listen to them on the studio monitors. So I'll listen to them in here. And when you listen to something on studio monitors, as a producer, you're like, holy crap, they panned that thing there, or they did this. Like things that you would not think of that you just didn't perceive, especially on those records when you're younger. Like I really liked the band Sepultura when I was younger, and Roots, is basically one of the early new metal records, right?
Mm-hmm.
And listening back to that or something like that, production wise, there's so much cool stuff that just like, you're young, you're like, oh, this is kind of like just heavy and whatever, and like that's probably not even in my top 5 favorite Sepultura records, but I can appreciate the production on it a lot, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of tricks, and there's things that I think sound a lot better than you remember. The guy who we had mix Absent Light, Steve Evans.
Yeah.
I listened back through Steve Evans' catalog. He did Turmoil, The Process of, one of my favorite hardcore records. He did the Buried Alive, Death Your Perfect World. He did Calculating Infinity. He did all the Snapcase. He did all these records that sounded phenomenal. And when we were looking for a mixing engineer for that, we were listening back, and we didn't know who we wanted to mix the record. I knew that I didn't want to do it because I was too involved in the project, and I was like, this will just be a nightmare that never ends. So we were listening to all these influences, and we were like, shit, man, that Turmoil record still sounds awesome. So we are just like, what if we reached out to Steve Evans, who works with Ross Robinson on projects now and stuff like that? But we reached out to him because of going back, and exactly as you said, going back and noticing like, damn, this dude has sounded amazing for decades.
The thing that's interesting to me about Evans being a fan, due to what he's done with like Static Lullaby and Every Time I Die, and even worked with my friend's band Wilson, because I sent a drunken tweet one night to him. Um, but I mean, like he's worked with The Cure, which I mean to me, it's like you want to talk about what I feel like a production or producer's dream would be working with The Cure, because you get to do so much with like layering and
Oh,
just
atmosphere.
so much
Yeah,
shit that it's like I feel like if you're a producer and or a mixer, like probably getting a Cure record or even getting to work on it, you're probably just like wetting your pants from excitement of just that,
for sure.
or you're gonna like shit your pants out of sheer terror of like how the fuck do I do this and not make it sound terrible. But yeah, that to me, I think that him working with The Cure is probably, and a handful of bands like that though, I think shows like how well versed he is in what he does as far as being
Ab-
a producer.
Absolutely, he's one of the best. It was kind of stressful working with him, and I think some of that was just because of how particular I was, and his style of mixing is different than my style of mixing. I mean, he's definitely better, has a better grasp on everything than I. I'm not saying I'm doing anything better, but it's like I set up the record differently, production wise, and I do think that the mix of Absent Light is cool, but I was envisioning something a little different. But I still had a great time working with him. Overall, he's just so old school, analog, entire mix on a board, and no two songs on that record sound the same because he like resets all of his settings every song and then just redoes the next song, which is like completely different than it is for me, who's like in the computer for a lot of the mix. But
Interesting. I always wondered if with when people like that work together, they end up like bashing heads more, like initially, just because it's like you have an idea of what you want, but like they have an idea of what it should be, and then so like you're just kind of fighting for a little bit until
yeah,
it's like done.
I think there was some tense moments, but not he was awesome. I think I was just like stressed out. It took us 3 months to track that record. I was like so exhausted and um, probably overly opinionated on certain things, and I should have relaxed on some stuff for sure. But like he's a champ. I mean, that guy's made so many records for so many years that he's certainly, I'm sure, dealt with people that were worse than me and whatever. And we got along fine. We were happy with the end result. Absolutely. But
Um,
there was definitely like a old school and new school. You know, we're coming at it from different points because I remember talking to him and being like, well, the bass drum sounds awesome in this one song. Can we make the bass drum sound like that in this other song? And he's like, that's not really what I do. I just ground up feel it for he starts with like things in the general area, but he like feels every song differently. And in my mind, like I was like trying to set up the record to have a consistent sound and then let the parts be what was different. Like this part's clean, but this part's heavy, but I want this part that's heavy to have the same drum sound as the heavy part in this other song.
right.
We just had different approaches, but it made me learn. Like I learned a lot through doing that, and I apply some of the things I've learned from him to what I do now.
Something, and this may be my lack of being in your end of everything, but just from a fan's perspective, it's something I've kind of wondered. So with the last Mr. Signals record that you worked on, and I kind of hate harping on this, but like it's a great launching point for a lot of different parallels of questions that I have.
Sure.
So with that record, it was crowdfunded, and
Yep.
granted, you were in the band, so I mean, maybe the pressure of what I'll bring up is on it twofold. But do you feel that when there's a record that's been crowdfunded, do you feel there's an added pressure between the band and even you as the producer to make it the I shouldn't say the best that it should be because it always should be the best that it should be. But when I feel like a fan is funding the record, there's added pressure for the product to be well received because it's not like some label just handed you a shitload of money and it's like, oh, we'll see, we'll market it, whatever, and if it fucking works, it works. Like, there's
Yeah.
so much more pressure. I would feel like if people were giving me their hard earned money and being like, we believe in you and we love you so much, like, here's money, fucking make this record. That if they go like, man, this record sucks, it's like, oh shit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, going into it, at first I was really hesitant and skeptical about crowdfunding the album in general because often crowdfunding comes across as really corny to me.
Mm-hmm.
And like bands are like, for $2,000 you can hang out with us, and that's like probably the farthest thing from punk rock,
Yeah.
and from where I came from that you could possibly do as a band. So I was hesitant to it, and but the guys liked the idea. Ryan had a really good vision for it, and what was important to me was that we kind of ran it as more or less a pre-order. You basically you would you know uh, donate or whatever, or pledge the amount of money that it would cost to get the record, and then you'd get the record. It wasn't like, hey, we need, we're begging you for money. It was a way for us to sell the record before we made it so that we could make it and cut out the middleman. Because I do really hate when bands are like, hey, go, we need $500 to fix our van. We're going to set up a GoFundMe. It's like, just come on, dude, like sell shirts or like put a sale on your merch online or something like that. So
Right.
it was important for me, and a lot of people did react to it, like, oh, what the hell is wrong with these guys? They're begging for money, but I think that criticism is just wrong because we just our perks that we put down were just buying the album. So the reason I mention that is because people, I don't know if it changed the um, pressure on it because people invest their money in it either way. They either invest it ahead of time like that, or they're gonna buy the album. You know, maybe buy the album. You don't want to let them down, even if a label did give you money and they go and spend $20 on a vinyl, and then the record sucks, and you just phoned it in, and you're like, thanks for the royalties I'll never see or something in peace.
Right.
But I will say that there was a lot of anticipation already. It was a stressful thing, but I felt excited about it. From yeah, the crowdfunding adds a little, but I still treat every album with that. You know, I have like a great respect and reverence for like trying to add an album to a band that I looked up to Misery Singles, to their catalog and not just fuck it up for myself as a fan. You
Right.
know,
No, like I said, I kind of going into it with that question, like I was like, I know this is kind of a stupid question because I know the answer, but or at least I feel like I would know the answer. But on the flip side of it, it's like maybe it does add more pressure than a normal recording process just because of the
I mean,
environment.
it definitely does a little. I think some of the bigger like uh, tiers of things that people could do. Like some of them were like having kids. It wasn't too much money, but like kids could come and do like the group vocals on the record and stuff like that. And they would come to my studio here, and I try to give them like the best time and just hang out and like talk. And I'm still friends with a lot of those people that came to that to this day. Like just straight up actively friends with them, follow each other on Instagram, all this kind of stuff. Because like I just didn't want to be on the pedestal or anything like that. So there was like pressure just to be like cool. Like if people put in their money, like make sure that they got their money's worth for the different perks beyond even the album. Just like make sure everything was a cool experience, and tried to with that album we'd really tried to you know I tried to combine, at least from my perspective, I tried to combine the three records beforehand, like aspects I liked of each record beforehand, so that the hopefully the fans, of the band or people that like the band still thought it was cool and not just like a lazy attempt.
Kind of shifting a little bit from the record and producing per se. I noticed, excuse me, I noticed recently that you are hosting a comedy night
At the studio,
at
yeah.
the studio, and something when you posted the initial idea or that it was going to be happening, your thought was that you wanted to kind of turn the studio into like an alternative space for events, I guess, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, basically the studio is pretty small. It's not, I don't have the biggest live room, but I can fit, good 20, 30 people in there to just like come out for something like this. The comedy night kind of came out really randomly. From one of my best friends, Corey Straffolino, who used to play with me in that band that made the EP all those years ago that I talked about, The Risk Taken. Corey's gone on to play in a number of bands. He's in La Dispute currently, but he's also been in like Defeater and Life in Your Way and all these things. And I was talking to him, and he was telling me about how he was just doing comedy, starting to moonlight as a comedian when he's not on tour with La Dispute. And I was like, man, I would love to see you do that. And he's like, yeah, I'd love to do one in Connecticut and have all our friends come out. And we're just kind of like, wait a second, we could do this at the studio, and it just kind of came out at random. And he's coming out with a friend of ours, Luke Schwartz, who again I recorded here. He used to play in Make Do Amend, and he is in Tiger's Draw now. And they're like doing like a little comedy tour, the two of them together. But the kind of the launching point is just doing it in the studio, and we're gonna record it and see what happens. Just have some friends over and hopefully have a cool night.
Is there plans to, if it goes well, to kind of maybe do this sporadically, like for other people maybe that you don't know, like other someone, like obviously I would assume it'd have to be someone that you would want to work with in that capacity, but is that
Yeah.
kind of a goal, like to kind of make it a weird alternative space for something cool?
So I mean, Yeah, absolutely. I think of the studio. This is gonna sound like some, I don't know, like hippie bullshit or something like that. But like the studio to me, like I've always felt thankful to the people that have recorded here, and I've always tried to bond. I've always like bonded with the bands. Like most of the bands I record here end up like my best friends, and they're always there for me, and I love to see them, and that's what I always say. And people are like, "How's recording?" It's like I work with my best friends every day. It's amazing. But all these friends of mine, so many of them have all these other talents and things that they do. And if I have the means or ability to support them or to be a part of it or to witness it or to encourage them, I will try to do it. So, like, as far as friends do in comedy, that's such a wild, cool thing. And Corey would tell me about how it's like, he's like, oh, the comedy circuit's like DIY hardcore punk. You just go and you don't get paid for most of your shows, and you get like 5 minutes, and that's it. And I love the I don't know. I love the DIY spirit of just going out and doing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you talk to Matt Mixon here. I love that he's going out and doing filmmaking, and
Mm-hmm.
I have friends that are authors now, and friends that are comedians now, and stuff. And if there's any way that I can support that, and I have the means to do it, then I'm all for it. Whether it's like I'd even do shows here, small shows. I mean, 20 people come and have fun like that. The idea of that is just that's exciting to me. That's like a just a fun time. Keeps it small and compact and intimate, like what we were talking about earlier. How some of those smaller shows, those smaller things, can be the most impactful.
I think the first time I saw something like that, where you could put it like in a studio kind of setting and have a show between Comeback Kid and the Misery Signals Rain City sessions, it's like, holy shit, that looks awesome. Like it sounds great, obviously because it's in a studio, but then you put in like, however many fucking people you can pack in there, and then just have a show, but it's also in a studio. I was like, man, that's pretty rad. And
Yeah,
it's
when I saw that, I was like, that was something that I wanted to do like years ago, and I recorded a set similarly to here that just never came out for that band Make Do and Mend.
mhm.
And when I saw them when Misery Singles, when I was talking to Ryan, they're like, "Oh, we're gonna do this thing in the studio." I was like, "Fuck, that's." They kind of beat me to the punch. I wanted to do that. I love the idea of that though. That's a super cool thing, and it to me, I do love Audio Tree and things like that. But having the audience, like
Yeah,
taking hardcore punk away from the audience, is like taking half the experience away. So having some kind of audience there to sing along or to just be a part of it is like more true to like,
the
yeah,
vibe
hardcore.
and the yeah.
Yeah,
I was gonna say like, cause the band I was talking about earlier, Wilson, they did, between them and Let Live, I think are the only two bands I can think of that I've seen do their Audio Tree performance, and it was pretty on par with their actual live show. Because like usually both frontmen are just kind of outrageous, between Jason and Chad, like both kind of going nuts. Like Chad literally had to take his headphones and duct tape like it to his head because he was like moving around so much, like it just wouldn't
that's
fucking stay
cool.
on. Um, so I mean, it is kind of interesting to see. Again, like I keep calling them kind of alternative spaces, but I feel like that's from the alternative comedy scene from the mid 90s or so that was kind of coming around, and people
Yeah,
playing in like coffee houses and random places that it's akin to growing up in hardcore and in metal, like seeing a lot of places like I just saw like a couple of bands are playing a grocery store. Like that seems to be
yeah.
a new trend.
One of those, one of the bands that was on that post, Lesser Men, is a band that we just finished a record for. They're on their record release tour,
Okay.
and when I saw that, I was like, hell yeah, fuck it,
It's
like
like
because
a
I've done shows like that. I've played shows in all sorts of little, coffee shops for sure. Some of my favorite shows are in these little like weird restaurants and on actually one of the best shows that I was ever able to do with Misery Singles was a co-headlining Misery Singles Bad Rabbits show
oh
at
yeah,
at a coffee house in Boise, Idaho,
yeah,
where Ryan lives, and like that was the most fun. And it was just it's a coffee shop, but it was packed with kids, and it was and Bad Rabbits are incredible. They're
yeah.
they fantastic. So it was a super cool show.
Are you being out on the East Coast? Are you familiar with I can't remember the drummer's name, but his other band, Irrepress?
No, I don't know that.
Should check that band out. I
Yeah,
saw them. Yeah, it's basically like an instrumental band, but they go from like kind of ethereal, like lots of delayed kind of guitars, and then slowly build it up, and then it kind of gets heavy and has a groove to it. A friend of mine ended up having them at our house with or at a different at their house, and it was like them and not Glassfield, I can't remember Battlefields, um, and a handful of other bands. But it was like everything from like kind of dirty crust punk metal shit to like this kind of like shoegaze whatever. And I just remember it was like these like five dudes, and they had like a keyboard player and shit, and they had like their own little like light rig they set on the floor, and they just turned off all the lights and had this like thing going. And I don't remember if it was like programmed or anything. And
That's
there's no
cool.
microphones, so like at one point like there's like a vocal s kind of thing, and all five dudes like from around the room just kind of all chant this thing, and it's just like this is the most badass thing I've ever fucking seen. And I like
Dude,
walked away
I
being a
love
huge
stuff like
fan.
that. I love
But
stuff like that. I kind of miss when you used to, or I mean, you can still do it. You go to shows and you see these bands that are not like trying to just groom themselves for Warp Tour. They're just doing genuinely weird shit. I love seeing the genuinely weird punk. Like, what the hell are these guys? I've never seen anything like this. Like this, a guy with an acoustic guitar screaming with like some light show behind him. Like, it's ridiculous, but it's fun. It's
yeah, yeah.
it's exciting.
I so we kind of spoke on that, and I'll kind of come back to the last few questions music based. But the other thing too, upon following you for a while on various social networking, that was something that I was like, I love all the shit this dude posts is your love of horror movies. And before we get going too far, hold on, I gotta find it real quick. Let's see if you can actually see this. Unplug myself from here.
Oh, nice, nice,
That's
Phantasm.
the show I wife. Um, we ended up doing some screen printed posters and such, but the inspiration was obviously Phantasm, which is one of my favorite horror
Yeah.
movies.
Oh,
And
same for sure. I love that movie.
it's it's definitely one of those things where I have a love for like older horror movies, and I feel like a lot of people don't like. I mean, I sent you the text earlier of they're remaking Flatliners, and it's not really a horror movie, but it's definitely like it was a scary movie when I was a kid to me.
Yeah, sure, for sure.
And
With Bacon and
God,
Kiefer
it had
Sutherland.
like everybody. Like if you were like a star of the like late '80s, early '90s, it had everybody. Um, but I feel like I just went back like the one night they were doing the Phantasm in 4K. That was it. J.J. Abrams was it J.J. Abrams that redid it or remastered it?
Abrams. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So we went to the theater to go see it. Like a friend of mine and his wife and I, and we both had hyped it up. Like now, granted, when we got out of the movie, he was like, "God, that was awful. Like I don't remember it being so bad." I was like, "Have you not seen Phantasm in like the last 10, 15 years since you got older?" He goes, "No," and I was like, "Oh man, I've watched it enough to know that it's like this movie's not the greatest looking, and it really makes no fucking sense." And I go, "But it's just a fucking classic." Like one of
It's
my other
fun.
favorite like shitty B horror movies is Motel Hell.
Yep.
Just have an affinity
Classic.
for the old classics that I don't feel like I feel like I know it's a big thing, and I know it's a big genre that people are into, like being horror and classic horror movies and such. But I noticed that you have more of the affinity for, I guess they're known as like the classic Universal monsters. It seems.
I do love the Universal monster stuff, and I mean, I really love the late '70s and into the '80s horror stuff as well. The reason I love that time period so much, and the Universal monster stuff from like the '30s and '40s, is because horror is a really interesting genre. When the movie's bad, it's still fun, but when the
Yes.
movie's good, it's enjoyable.
Yes.
And it's not really like that for a lot of other genres. I mean, if you watch a bad drama, you're bored, you're gonna fall asleep, or a
Bad
period piece.
comedy.
Or bad comedy is painful,
Yeah.
but bad horror is comedy gold.
Yes.
Because it's so extreme. So that's one of the reasons I was drawn to the genre. It's a fun genre to be into because if you'd be hard pressed to find movies in the '80s that don't have some fun or enjoyment value, even when they're just the shittiest.
Now, speaking of horror, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that you went and saw John Williams in concert. literally
John
in or
John
John Carpenter.
Carpenter.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Everyone's been on this. I blame. Kept seeing a bunch of Star Wars shit today at the theater, and I was like, aren't those movies done for a while now? Like the next one's not coming out till like next year, but so I've had like Star Wars on the brain because I'm like, God, how many fucking movies does? I'm not a Star Wars fan, clearly,
I
but
remember you saying that during Mixon's podcast. I was like, oh,
yeah,
interesting.
I. It's like on the podcast I did with fuck, I don't remember who it was off the top of my head, but oh, it was Josh, Killswitch's production manager, and so he and I were talking, and like right away we're like, it's like, you know who else I don't fucking like, and I think that like our overrated is like the fucking Rolling or Led Zeppelin. And I was like, oh my god, me too. I don't get it. And then it's like, he's like, oh, and the Beatles. And I was like, fuck, I think we just became best friends because like I say this shit all the time, and everyone looks at me like I'm like blaspheming and shit like that. But same with I mean, between like a lot of the composers of movies and John Carpenter kind of bringing it back, horror movies have really iconic soundtracks, and I feel like that's maybe something that's kind of gone. Like I was watching the movie Life last night, the Ryan Reynolds and Jake Gyllenhaal movie, which was more or less like a pseudo wannabe reimagining of Alien, but not done
Yeah,
nearly as well.
I haven't
Um,
seen that.
yeah, that's why I didn't really say too much. It's worth watching for sure. It's got some interesting ideas, but as a whole, it's pretty predictable all the way through. Um, but when there were moments kind of happening, I was like, the thing that I'm missing is like, that classic horror soundtrack that John Carpenter and some of these people put their stamp on these movies, or even to the effect of like if you want to look at something like Lost Boys, it didn't necessarily have the most memorable original score, but the music that they chose to have in it was very memorable for those specific scenes that
Oh,
songs are
yeah,
in. So it's one of those things that I had kind of wondered too, knowing obviously you being a producer and loving music as a whole, and being into horror, like how much have you realized how much maybe like the production and the scoring of movies has influenced you?
oh my god! Honestly, I would say that film scores above everything else are my biggest influence for music writing. My actual biggest influence. When I outside of I was saying I would listen to bands like Catalog or listen to the stuff that influenced them. For me, when I'm trying to get melodic ideas, I listen to film scores almost all the time. It's like and I think you can probably see some elements of that in music that I do, especially Absent Light. We have the string ensemble play
Mm-hmm.
throughout it. That comes from my love for film scores and want to do that. So it's a huge influence on me. The kind of moody nature. The thing for me about film scores and soundtracks and stuff like that, film scores are designed to create an emotional response.
Mm-hmm.
They're music designed to make you sad when a character's sad, or to make you nervous or anxious when things are intense. And people forget that about like rock or whatever. They'll just be like, this part's cool. And as a producer, I have to, I talk to people all the time. It's like, yes, but does this make you feel anything? Like, technically, that part is cool, but do you feel anything? The same way that there's certain like progressive metal bands that I just don't really get into. A band like Dream Theater or something like that, where they're like technically super proficient. I can't play a single riff that they have,
Right.
but does it make me feel anything? Not often. So the big thing for me with listening to film scores is like, yes, like this note movement strikes a chord with me. This layer or this feel or this atmospheric choice makes me feel something. How can I use that to get my audience to garner an emotional response from them? So it is a huge influence on me. John Carpenter, his films and his scores for those films, not only being the director and writer, but being the guy who wrote those scores, is a huge influence on me. I listen to um, the score for The Thing or Halloween or Escape from New York. I listen to those frequently and draw inspiration from them frequently. And as you're saying, as far as it changing, I still think that there are guys out there doing film scores now that are amazing. I mean, Hans Zimmer is one of
Yeah.
the all-time greats, and there are people out there doing fantastic work. But there is also some stuff that does. I think Hans Zimmer came in and he does all these grand swelling of strings and horns, and then there's all these like Hans Zimmer lights out there.
Right.
Like they try to do the same thing. So like a lot of film scores now are starting to all be like swell based, whereas like we think back to when we're younger, you think the Indiana Jones theme, the Batman theme, the Star Wars theme. But these newer movies, you can't hum the theme because it's like, oh, the theme is it's like just a single note swell, and we are missing. It's still cool, but it has changed from creating specifically memorable themes for characters to just more pad oriented
Right.
for film scores.
Well, what's interesting is I don't remember what podcast I was listening to, and it might have been even the Jericho one when he was talking about various like old school like 60s, 70s wrestling and stuff like that. Someone was bringing up, and I should have remembered. I actually was going to send you an email and be like, remind me to bring up this to trigger the actual thought. But I had recently was trying to think of when knew I was going to ask you about the horror movies and composers and stuff. That I was like, the last theme to something I can really think of that people like the average person would know, like everyone knows Jaws, like dun, 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 like everyone knows that. The last one I could really think of that like if in the last like 10, 15, 20 years would have been like Austin Powers. But I
Yeah,
had recently learned that that is actually a song that had existed from
already.
way before, and I thought it was music composed for that. And so when I found out, I was like, holy shit. So even that isn't
Yeah.
technically like made for that. Like it's not. But then even speaking to the Jaws, like we were looking for a record store while we were in Boston yesterday, and we ended up. My wife looked up, found a Berkeley music, and it didn't click in my head initially when she was like, "Oh, there's a Berkeley College or Berkeley music store over here," and I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." And then when we started walking, I was like, "No, I think this is for Berkeley College of Music. It's a music store for the college, not a music store." So we walked
Yeah.
in. I found to be that I was correct with that assumption. But what was interesting is it had some art prints in there, one of which spurned a great joke, which was it was just a guitar, and then it just said, "I like to play." And I sent a text to my friend that was like, "I feel like this should be a symbol with a drumstick from Wayne's World after Wayne
Yeah.
or Garth after he rips that drum solo," and then it was like, "Thanks, I like to play." Which my friend was like, "I'm at work dying laughing, and no one knows why. So thanks for that." The other it was a photo of a shark and underwater with an orchestra. There was no music notes, no nothing. Just that was what it was, and I was like, I like the subtle nod to that music made this mythical creature like be larger than life.
100%. I mean, the music is so people have talked about it at length, but like Jaws, they couldn't show the
Mm-hmm.
shark. They didn't have the effects, the mechanical shark that they had. I think they
Bruce.
named Bruce. Yeah, it was just always it didn't work. So they're like, all right, well, how about these couple piano notes can kind of let you know that the shark's there, even though we're going to be from the shark's perspective like that.
Yeah. Um, what has been I guess we'll start slowly wrapping this up. What has been your favorite horror movie recently that's come out?
Well, I gotta say, for recently, something that I saw, The Witch. I did like The Witch. I know a lot of my friends are kind of split on that film, but to me, that just struck like a Kubrick kind of feel to me. It felt like almost like The Shining in the woods. So I don't know if did you see The Witch at all? Did you get a chance to?
I haven't actually. There's a lot of those movies that based on the trailer and talking with Mix and he's like, I don't watch trailers because it spoils shit. But it's like half the time I'm like, I need to know like what the fuck I'm going into though too. So no, I haven't seen it because it didn't really catch me because I was like, I don't still really know what this is
It,
about.
it's like a lot of my friends like it's slow and boring, but I liked it. It was like a slow burn, just creepy film with dark imagery. It felt like an older film in a way that it wasn't like here it is in your face all the time. It's tension and paranoia, which is like kind of goes back to my favorite horror film of all time, which is John Carver's The Thing, which just feeds off of the tension and the paranoia and the feeling of like who is it?
Isolation.
Yeah, and The Witch kind of captures a little of that. I'm not saying it's the greatest, you know, movie of all time, but as a fan of horror, I'm not as in love with horror in the 2000s.
Hmm.
There are definitely films that are amazing, but I'm not as in love with this era of horror as I am late 70s, early 80s, or 30s and 40s horror.
I think the one of the last handful of movies that I've seen, and this still is an older movie. I think it's at this point at least over a decade old was High Tension.
I've actually never seen that. I know,
It's
and it's a classic.
it's so fucking great until their big like plot
The
twist at the end, and you're just like, fuck, man, like you've had an like, it's just a kind of a letdown. It's a great movie, and I still watch it, and I still highly recommend it to so many people.
Yeah,
But
I'm like fucking up having not seen that. I started it once a long time ago, and I something happened. I got distracted, and I just for whatever reason never went back to it.
the
I
other
need
one,
to.
I was gonna say the other one too recently, and I'm starting to. Netflix will start being my friend again because they have all these like European and Italian like horror movies and shit, which I think I feel like they're kind of getting back to more of that like late 80s, kind of like the sweet spot of horror, and they're kind of doing that with like a slightly modern twist. I ended up catching a movie while we were in Denver right before we left. Someone had Netflix on it, like a dive bar we were at, and this movie was called, and I'm probably gonna mispronounce the name for sure. It was called Bus to Busan or Train to Busan.
I
Busan.
saw.
That
Yeah, I saw it.
movie. Now, granted,
Cool.
I didn't get to see it with audio. I only could read the subtitles, which is whatever. Because I mean, I feel like half the time when you're watching a movie like that and you can't understand the language, you kind of don't need the audio really. But watching the movie, I was like, this movie's fucking crazy, and it just
Yeah,
takes that
I
like
actually like that one.
it was really solid. And part of me wants to go back and rewatch it, but
It's a big Korean film, right? It's like
yeah,
a.
yeah, it's yeah, and it
I
was
tell
really
you,
interesting and definitely kind of played off of like some of the that like shit that happens at the end of the movie without spoiling anything. But the way things happen, everyone has to keep making sacrifices for the people who keep surviving the events that are happening in this movie, to where the ending of it is very like holy shit, and then it's like you don't see that like everyone's like, oh well, this is the good guy and he wins and he lives, and it's like it's all nicely wrapped up in the last like 5 minutes. Like what the fuck, like that's not how shit really happens. Like
yeah, oh yeah. That I mean, that's yeah. That movie was a very cool movie just because at this point, zombie stuff has been beaten to death. You know, like a lot of my my favorite some of my favorite horror films, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, the originals of those, um, kind of just did it all, and everything's like a diminishing returns retread of Dawn of the Dead or something like that, or Return of the Living Dead, something in that nature. But Train to Busan, or however you say it,
yeah.
probably messed that up. That was cool because it had this like forward moving claustrophobic feel because they were in the train with it, which is like a just a different, you know, just kind of a different experience.
plus,
So yeah,
plus I
that
was
one
gonna
actually
say
stood out.
plus like you said with the thing, it kind of really it starts pitting people against people,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
was interesting.
yeah. I think that's kind of like one of my favorite things in horror when you get something like that. You know, like again, classic Dawn of the Dead or Night of the Living Dead. The worst people that the protagonists have to face are other humans. They're not even the zombies.
Right.
They're other people, selfish things. Which horror's also got that too. It's got the social commentary. It's always had that,
Yeah.
and it's always challenging boundaries. And is horror's like, I guess obviously it's like the hardcore punk of film.
How do you feel this? How do you feel the focus on making a new universe for the Universal monsters? Because it started with the rebranding of the Mummy, but which I've heard is done very terribly. So I don't really know if
Yeah,
they're going to proceed with the rest of the movies or if this basically just shot that all in the ass.
I think that the idea of it is cool, but I do think there's something to be said, like uh, Marvel's going and creating their universe, and then there's all these people that are just kind of coming late to the party, where they're like, "Oh, this one company is doing this, and they're having a lot of success, so we're gonna try to do that too." Uh, the idea of it is great because Universal Monsters, that was kind of the first shared cinematic universe, because you would have Frankenstein and Dracula and Wolfman show up in each other's movies. Whereas I can't think of any films, genre or series that predates that was doing that kind of thing. So they're trying to go back to their roots, like, okay, let's create a shared universe. But at the same time, there's a lot about horror that does not thrive on A-list stars and A-list budgets. I'm not saying you can't make compelling good horror films with A-list caliber things, but part of the charm of the genre in general is fighting out the DIY spirit of it with low budget things. And that's what those old, Frankenstein, all those things, those were just guys like making it up as they went along. And going back to it now with, Tom Cruise and, I don't even think he's a bad actor, but I just don't know if that's going to capture the charm, So it's probably, I would imagine that that's going to end up being a failed endeavor. I like that they're trying. I would love for it to be successful, but my money, I would bet against it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Um, I kind of have to feel like I have to bring this up. These last two topics. Um, and the last kind of line of question I had after I edited out all that shit later on, um, the Misery Signals documentary. Let's.
Yeah.
It's really weird because obviously you heard the episode I do with Mixon, so like I didn't see the completed 100% final edit that is out now, but I saw
Mm-hmm.
like apparently according to Mixon like the 98.5 percent done. Uh, Obviously some of like I saw you in a handful of shots that were there at one of the shows. Having watched the documentary, excuse me, from being a part of the band, because there's some, obviously you weren't in the band when Jesse was in the band, so there's old past grievances or whatever. Like they kind of mention with the traveling and some of his idiosyncrasy kind of things that he does,
Mm-hmm.
his OCD nature. But then there's some of the stuff that gets brought up from around the time frame of you being in the band. As an outsider watching the documentary and not having a hand in the documentary at all in the editing process or even being around for any of the filming, really, what was it like to watch something like that you were kind of a part of? Like, I feel like that's kind of got to be weird to be a part of something, but to be removed from it at the same time.
Yeah, it was interesting to watch. I mean, um, the thing about that documentary was these guys are some of my best friends. Ryan and Brandon, Kyle. They're some of my best friends. And Jesse, I've known since, like I was saying, like I did one of their first tours, and I would always keep it. He was actually the guy I hung out with the most on that early tour for the band, and I would see those guys, throughout the years. We did multiple tours with them. I toured with them when I was playing in Halud. We did a Canadian tour together. So I've known these guys for a long time, and I would consider, if ever I get married, those guys are my groomsmen. You know what I mean? Those are my like brothers. They're my best friends. Mixon too. Mixon is like one of my absolute best friends. But that said, watching the documentary, a lot of that story that the documentary kind of focuses on, I never knew a lot of that story. I knew that it happened,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not one of those things where you just go and like, hey, guys, remember when those dudes died? Like,
Yeah.
what was that like? It's like it was like a thing I never talked to Jesse about it. I never talked to Ryan or Stu about it. I had a respect for it, and I just knew that it was a really heavy subject that weighed heavily on the trajectory of the band and a lot of those songs. And so seeing it, like, it was a really emotional experience because I was like, man, these guys that are like my best friends, like they really went through some difficult stuff. And the scenes with Jesse and Stu in specific where they're tearing up, like I
Mm-hmm.
was too
Yeah.
watching. I actually watched I watched a rough cut of it as well. I was in the studio with Conveyor. They were here in the studio, and like Mixon and sent me. He's like, "This is basically done." So I watched it in the studio here with those guys, and literally just like, no shame. Like every guy was like tearing up and just like, "Holy shit!" Like the gravity of this,
Mm-hmm.
and also the desire that in the face of such tragedy that they still wanted to make music, that they still wanted to go out there with their friends, having risked it all and having some of them lose it all, to still do this thing, to be compelled to create music, to do these DIY tours. To me, it was inspiring. Like I was able to watch that as a friend of the band, as somebody who's been a part of the band, but as just somebody that took in the weight of the situation, who was I was also a fan of the band, and still supported them when they were when Ryan talked to me that hit like, hey, we're gonna do this 10-year anniversary Malice tour. I was like, fuck yeah, that's great, that's a great idea, I would love to see it, I will go to the shows, as you see me there. Like I was like supportive of it. um but watching that's a heavy documentary, but it's not just sad. I think there's also hope and inspiration in it too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I drew away. I mean, at the end of that, I was like, when I watched it, I reached out to those guys and was just like, hey, anytime you want to hang out, make music again, which is something that hopefully we will do with me still in the fold, actually, too. It's like something, in the bucket list of things that we'd like to do is to do some kind of collaborative recording, whether I'm producing or doing guitar or something like that, to make some music together again. And we'll just see if that comes together. But that was a heavy documentary to watch. It was such a range of emotions. I was so proud of Mixon for crafting what I think is one of the best documentaries that I've ever seen on music, and especially on like hardcore punk. Like one of the coolest, most compelling documentaries that I've seen. And I was like, wow, my friend made this. This is like amazing. But then also to like see the sorrow of my friends and what they went through, but to also see how much they've grown. I think that's one of the important things, is that when we were all that age, when it was like the early 2000s, we were all kind of emotional knuckleheads and super opinionated and fighting, and it was kind of refreshing to see that, like, after all that, because they like really didn't like each other for a while. Like, there was some uh, intense emotions after the split with Jesse and stuff like that had lingered on for years, and to see them put that aside and to just move forward with a friendship, that's like beyond music, beyond hardcore punk, beyond anything else. Like being able to like acknowledge that you might have messed up, or that you were harder on somebody that you should be, or any of those things, and to work that out and to still be friends and to still do what you love with your friends who are basically your family, is like, that's an important and powerful story that's worth telling and worth taking note of, and realizing that, like the grudges that you might have with old friends of yours now, those don't last forever. Like the friendships are more important than the little grudges or the arguments or the little fights and things like that. And then when all those things are like distilled in time, you kind of realize that. And when you can look back a little more maturely on the situation, you realize how important those friendships and those formative years were, and you hold each other closer. Like you especially as you get older, like that's like that you have your family and then you have your friends, but oftentimes your friends really are your family and really are who shape who you are. And if the shit hits the fan, those are the people that are going to be there for you.
For sure.
And it was just awesome to see, be able to kind of work out some of that.
I think it was really hard because like I didn't want to like ruin shit for people, like since I had seen it so far in advance. Although a handful of people, when they knew like kind of what I was talking about, they're like, "Wait a minute, you've seen this movie?" And I go, "Yeah, I've seen it." What's it about? I'm like, "No, I'm not gonna ruin it for you," because like I think half of it is just going into it not and letting everything unfold in front of you and letting you feel everything that Matt sets up for you as the viewer to feel when things are happening and coinciding with the tour. Like it's shocking how all that shit happened in a week. Like that all of those stories, all those emotions, all of those things that happened within a week, and he was able to capture as much as he did
Yeah,
is amazing.
it's it happened in that short. You know, I think it was like 11 days or something, like just like barely over a week.
Yeah.
But it had been years building up to that.
Right.
You know, like I played a show, two shows with Misery Singles, I believe, or no, just one that I was playing guitar, and one that I was on tour with them in the Edmonton area. That Jesse got up on stage and would do the year summer and June, and just do something like that. And I remember even back then, like years ago, it was like, wow, this is cool that he would do this. This is pretty rad that they're at this point. So like, even though that took place in like a week, it was over a decade to get of
Right.
growing up, of maturing, of appreciating what they did have, and just having a better, older, wiser perspective on it.
Yeah, for sure. I think something I would like to see, I think down the road, and when and if, I can't really speak to the relationships of everybody that's ever been involved in the project. I mean, based on those who have seen the documentary, you'll kind of get what I'm alluding to. But with that being said, I recently was listening to Haste the Day's Coward record that they did, where there's been so many different members of Haste the Day at this point that collectively they did their last record where it was like everybody that's been in the band kind of came together to write. So like the original lineup got together, did a couple of songs. There's songs with Steven who replaced, Jimmy Ryan, their original vocalist. There's, the incarnations of the last band coming in to like record with the original members and so forth. Like there's the entire lineup across the whole record. And I was thinking to myself, since there really hasn't been that many members, it'd be really interesting to see Misery Signals do that. I think when there's like, or even a band like Killswitch, like it'd be interesting. Like, granted, Killswitch did it on the like one of the special editions of like End of Heartache. Jesse was on like the chorus of one of the songs, kind of like a passing of the torch kind of thing. Um, but I think it'd be interesting down the road if and when like there's ever like a project, it'd be interesting to kind of be like the entity as a whole known as Misery Signals records something with like everybody that's been a part of the band. I think that would be an interesting thing. Maybe
Yeah,
even at one point there's like three guitar players, two bass players,
yeah,
and two
I
vocalists
think
or whatever.
I think that hopefully maybe some kind of thing like that will happen. I remember we wanted to get Jesse to sing on Absent Light, and he was like unsure if he still had a voice for it, and he ended up not. We ended up, I think, Mixon sang the part that we were thinking for him on that record, and yeah, I think, I mean, ideally for me, I would like to be a part of perhaps a final chapter that bookends in for Misery Signals. But the one thing about the film that's I don't know how clear it is, but there's still uncertainty as to what's happening, and like it doesn't really leave, like I don't want to spoil it, so if somebody hasn't watched it and is listening to this, and cover your ears for a second, but it doesn't necessarily leave off with like, hey, we're definitely going to do this and we're going back in the studio. It's just like, hey, we care about each other and this would be cool to maybe do again, or maybe it's over now. There's still that uncertainty in the band
I was gonna say it was kind
at
of
this
weird
point.
because it's like I got that vibe, but then right around the time of the of that being announced, when Mixon and all them announced it like a year or two early, I think Jesse went on record in an interview like, yeah, the goal, we're gonna go record, like we're writing, we're doing all this stuff, and then it was just kind of like the documentary didn't come out, and then nothing has come out from the band, so everyone's like, what the fuck's going on, and who is in the band, and it's like, I mean, it's
Yeah,
kind of like the go ahead.
there's definitely ambiguity. I mean, there's time where like there's for certain times where I'm like, am I in the band? Am I not in the band? I don't really know. Like um, like on my Instagram, it says something like I played past tense guitar and Mr. Singles, but at the same time, it'll be like, okay, when are we getting together to write this new stuff? Like so there is that kind of ambiguity, and I think Jesse was really excited on doing the idea, and I hope that he still is. I haven't talked to him in a little while about it, but I think it is something that I would hope that we'd eventually get together and do. It just gets harder as people's lives
Oh, I was gonna say
go.
all of you have completely different. I mean, I think Brandon is out with Matt, like out in the Pacific Northwest. It seems you just said Ryan like has got his like studio or not a studio, it's like dojo or whatever for jujitsu stuff going on, and his
Yep.
kids, and Jesse I think is still a teacher. I think
Yep.
still teaching. So I
Yeah,
mean, and you're busy
I
recording.
think
So
you got a kid on the way too.
plus, I was gonna say Stu's in the throes of comeback kid.
Yep, he's doing
So,
writing and for them, which is a really cool fit. I think Stu with Comeback Kid is sounds great.
but I hopefully Jesse's actually someone I would love to talk to, him and Keith, because like being teachers and being vocalists, I think there's a lot of interesting things that would be interesting to talk to and discuss. And especially being a teacher, it's like being in a band that was somewhat relevant, like a very integral like part of a fledgling scene before it really like got to where it was going. It's like
Yeah.
I feel like it's like when Keith was like doing Every Time I Die and was like kind of building that. It's like when people like I know he has mentioned that like people would be like, I saw you play, or he'd be at a show and like some underage kids drinking. He's like, hey, what the fuck are you doing here? And then they're like, what are you doing here? He's like, I'm in this band. So it's like this weird duality of like, here's my profession, and then here's like this thing I do that I'm also known for, and all that. And I think that'd be very interesting to kind of like unravel and see like what that's like. But I know Jesse's
Oh,
very hard to get a hold of and very private, it seems. So I don't really want to pry too hard and be like, yo, let me do this with you.
he
But
he has a degree of keeping to himself, but he's also he's definitely an easy person to talk to when you can.
yeah,
He is a very down to earth guy. Like I said, I've always uh, had a lot of love for Jesse. Like he was the guy that I kind of hung out with the most when I first met the band. So
yeah, I think
I was excited to see them reconcile.
I was gonna say I think the goal was because Brandon was supposed to do something with me eventually, and that's it was funny. Mason goes, "Hey, here's his number. He's expecting you." And I texted him like 5 minutes later and haven't gotten anything back. I was like, "Oh, okay." And it was a very awkward thing.
Yeah,
Like,
that kind of happens. I mean, I blew. You emailed me, and it took me
well,
a few.
that was the difference between an email and a text. I texted him, and he's got an iPhone, so I can see like.
So,
So like I was just like, okay, all right, I'll try back again in like
well,
a few months or
I would
something.
encourage you. I would encourage you to reach back out to him because he's definitely not like. He's definitely an easy to talk to, approachable guy for sure. Like he must have just saw it spaced out, and
Yeah, no,
then
I.
it's out.
But I figured that the goal would be to get like everybody else, and then I'll like bounce back to Jesse and be like, so I've gotten everybody else. It's like Pokemon. I gotta collect them all at this point. So
Yeah,
let's do
for sure.
this. Last question,
Sure.
definitively. I always play a song at the end of these podcasts. So, what would you like me to play? And maybe give a backstory as to why you choose that song. It can be something you produced, something you've been a part of.
Yeah, I remember you did the Burning Empire song at
That
the
was
end of
my
mixing.
choice.
Yeah, and I hadn't listened to that in a little bit, and I remember just thinking like, "Oh yeah, Ryan's voice is really cool." It's been a little bit since I listened. Um, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna I'll pick a song from Misery Singles Absent Light. Uh,
Okay.
I'll go with the song Ursa Minor, which is a later track on the album, but it's one that me and Ryan wrote together jointly, and it's one of the songs that I was able to write lyrically for that album that kind of connected me back with Jesse because he read the lyrics and then reached out to me and was like, "Oh, I really like the lyrics to this song. I heard you wrote them. I just want to tell you that I enjoyed them." And I was like, "Wow, thank you, man. That like meant a lot to me." And so as a tip, I guess I mean I could choose any of the songs from Malice or any of the other records or whatever, but I think that one was cool because that was purely me and Ryan writing that together, and is a later song that people might not be as familiar with on the album, but I think is one of the cooler songs on the album.
Awesome. Actually, it reminded me when you guys put out that 7 inch for the vinyl box set. Why? What made you all collectively choose to do that cover?
To do the older song, to do was it
The
like yesterday
yeah,
on it?
yep.
That was an idea that I kind of was throwing. Like a lot of the vinyl, like the box set and the 7 inch were stuff. Like I'm kind of a vinyl geek a
Mm-hmm.
little, so I was like, we should do these things because I like it when bands do these things. And we had a song that we didn't finish for the album that actually is one of the best songs from that writing time period. We just didn't finish it in time for the record. So We had that come out, and then we did that older song just because I loved that first EP. I met those guys when they did that first EP. One of my best friends from Connecticut was actually the first second guitar player for Misery Singles. So a lot of people don't know that there was a guitarist before Stu. His name was Jeff Ost, and he is actually Mixon's childhood best friend, which is how everything's connected. And then I knew Jeff from shows in Connecticut. Mixon actually grew up in Connecticut
Yep.
before he moved out. Um, so I loved that EP, and the recording's pretty rough on it, right? Like, it's cool, but it's like super rough. It'd be cool to redo one of those songs because I still thought that they held up, and I just wanted to hear what it would sound like with Carl, because like we haven't really talked about Carl too much, but um, I do respect Carl a lot, and I do think that his voice is very strong and very powerful. I wanted to hear what it sounded like with him. There was not been any recorded. There's no live record. There's no version of him singing any of Jesse's stuff.
No.
That's studio wise. So I just thought it might be a cool thing for people that like the band to hear the current lineup do one of the first songs written for it, which I think was actually a Seven Angels song that just got turned into a Misery Single song.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Writing. So, the idea was just to do that, just to like, a little bit of an oddity thing, and to kind of show that the entire catalog of the band, can kind of hold up and has merit across the board. For me, I mean, being a fan of the band first, I was like, I would like to see this. So I went and did it.
I was kind of wondering how that came about. The more I kind of was delving in it, I was sadly not one of the fortunate few that got that box set. So it came out right when I was like doing some other shit. And I was like, I could buy this, but then my wife would get mad because then we don't have extra money to go on vacations or that we had planned and all that kind of stuff.
Funny,
so
a lot of bands that I recorded here, people will swing by and be like, "Do you still have one of those?" Because I knew I shouldn't spend the money at the time, but maybe now I'd like to, or something like that.
yeah, I know I can find
them.
them. I actually someone finally hit me up for because on Discogs I got constantly emailed about or message for my controller or mirrors and controller split because I had Carl
Yep.
sign it, and then a bunch of people were like, "Yo, what do you want for it? What do you want for it? What do you want for it?" I'm like, well, "It's not for sale." And then finally somebody hit me up and they're like, "Yo, I'll give you like $175 for it," and I was like, "Okay." Like I had never thought about selling it ever, and then it was just like someone threw out like a super ridiculous number to me, and I was like, "All right, when is the last time I listened to this record? Like literally put it on," and I was like, "It's been at least probably 5 or 6 years easily," and then I was like, "I could buy other records that I really want, and I will listen to a lot more right now." And some other shit like that, $200 almost will go a lot further than just sitting on this record.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that either, because that person clearly really wants it in their
Yeah,
collection. They
yeah,
really want it, and it really means a lot to them. So it's not like you sold it for
no,
$200, whatever, and then it went into the garbage. Like it went to it's like it's not somebody. There's a collector out there that has that. That's like, I can't believe I have this. I never thought I would get
that
it.
it's signed too. Like that's kind of the weird thing is like even with booking shows and stuff like that, like I still am a fan of things, and that's something that I've kind of enjoyed, like with your horror movie stuff in the studio, is that like even though you do a lot of stuff behind the scenes and probably like the quote unquote like behind the curtain shit, like is all the mystery is gone for a lot of shit for you, as it is for me with a lot of things. I still am a fan. I still can remember, like I can throw on a record and it takes me back, and I still am a fan of these albums and these songs and so forth. And I fucking love that.
I,
And
I dude, I feel the same way. That's vital to, I don't know. I think people should never lose touch of that.
I think a lot of
That's
people do though. I think people get to be
that's
our age, and everyone like. I still go like we went to Warped Tour a couple of days ago and had a really unique experience that a lot of people won't get to have, of being able to go backstage and see shit side stage. And while I was aware of everything happening in the moment and watching the bands, I also couldn't help but like watch the sound guy and look around at the rig of like seeing like how everything was being done and like what it was being put together, and you're backstage and seeing all the work that goes into it that nobody gets to see on most occasions.
I've
And
been
to
kind
me, that was crazy to see the
yeah,
behind the scenes.
I've been kind of falling back in love with metal and hardcore, which I like wasn't listening to for a little bit, even though I was working on it. I've been falling back in love with it because my girlfriend's younger brother, B man, we
Yeah.
call him. We help raise him. We like raise him, and he's getting into metal. He's 13, so I've been taking him to all these shows. You know, we're going to see Metallica and Megadeth and Testament, and he likes a lot of the older metal bands, and it's like really captured to see it with him, and he's so excited. Has made where I'll just not even necessarily be backstage, or anything like that. Obviously, just be up
Experiencing it.
front and seeing it. I'm like, wow, this is awesome. I love this. I love going to shows. I want to still do this. I still am thankful for the career that I have and the opportunity to make music that I have. And I just try to make sure that fire just never burns out. And having other people with you, especially a younger generation getting into it, just makes me feel like a kid again too. And it's just like, keeps me focused and thankful for everything that I've been able to do. And part of me still feels like I'm getting started. So
I think it's as good a place as any to end on the podcast with. So
absolutely.
thank you for your time, and where can people find you on socials?
Well, first off, thank you for having me on. It's been awesome to talk to you about stuff for sure. And for the people listening to the podcast, John is a super cool guy to communicate with to even set up this thing, because I feel like we just started texting right away like we're friends. We never met, and then all of a sudden it's like, hey, have you seen that this movie's being remade, or seen that this thing's going on? So I don't think the people that listen to the podcast get the behind the scenes fact that you are just an approachable, cool guy that just reaches out and befriends these people that you have on here. So tip of the hat to you. Thank you for going out of your way to do that.
Making me blush.
And as far as finding me on social media stuff, my everything's under this Black Freighter. So my Instagram is Black Freighter. It comes from the old comic Watchmen. So Black Freighter on Instagram, Facebook.com/Black Freighter. There's Facebook.com/Silver Bullet Studios, which is my studio we talked about a couple times. So, or SilverbulletStudios.com, which has our discography and all the music videos that have come out of here. And, you can check that out and be like, wow, I never knew that he recorded this record. This album sounds not that great, but he sounds. So, no, but I'm proud of the work that we've done. And if people want to check that out, they can go onto the website or Instagram, also silverbulletstudios.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, man. Hope to
Awesome.
talk to you soon.